Welcome to the University of Arizona GIST podcast, co-hosted with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Development. Our hosts are Jennifer Mason and Jason Jurjevich, and they will be chatting with Dr. Monica Stevens, an assistant professor of geography at the University of Buffalo. Let's get started.
Hi, everyone. I am Jenny Mason, an assistant professor of practice here at the University of Arizona in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. I am joined by Dr. Jason Jurjevich, an associate professor of practice as well in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. And we are welcoming Dr. Monica Stevens, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Buffalo, as well as an assistant professor in geography at Durham University in the UK. So welcome, Monica, to our podcast series.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me.
Of course. And I want to note that this podcast series is co-hosted by the GIST program here at the University of Arizona, as well as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in our department. So to start out, when we were thinking about what we wanted to ask, Jason and I were actually curious how you see yourself or situate yourself within the geography discipline, or what kind of a geographer you envision yourself as.
Yeah, so I've always sat on the line between GIS and human geography. And so I've always defined myself within both of those realms. But more recently, I've been defining myself as a digital geographer, which is kind of a new and emerging field that the AAG has recently recognized as a subfield or a specialty group within the discipline.
So, Monica, I wanted to ask the second question about where you see struggles in your field relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and are there particular strategies that you try to implement to address these challenges?
Well, there are a number of challenges, and one is that there isn't very much diversity within the discipline, and then when there are diverse individuals, they aren't very included. They're often asked to speak for their particular communities and subdiscipline. In addition to there not being very many people of color, there are not that many women. And of the women that are within the discipline, there are very few mothers, people who have childcare obligations or even any sort of caregiving obligations within the field. And that makes it a real challenge to think about how inclusive our field can possibly be. It is a rapidly evolving field, which means that there really aren't very many abilities to take time off. Otherwise, you can become obsolete in like 6 months. So it's an ongoing challenge, and I don't really have much of a solution to it, unfortunately. I would love to see solutions built for this, but it is really a problem that we have. And I see this problem reproduce in a variety of different ways. This continues to reproduce in the discipline and in the field.
Monica, I'm curious because you're talking about diversity in the field, and I know that you said that you're a human geographer, but you also teach and do research, some would say in the GIS field as well. And I'm kind of curious if you noted there are any differences when you refer to diversity. And I guess I'm thinking both in terms of like the representation, those who are researchers, but also the type of research that people do. And like, I guess I'm just curious which field you're referring to, or if you find differences.
Right. I am referring to GIS more broadly. And what you'll see very, very, very few people of color, very few women of color, especially. And when you do, you largely see that they are focused on community dynamics, and they're asked to speak for people of their race and gender and how they're giving back to that particular race or gender. You don't generally see people crossing these lines. There's this general assumption that people of color are in community-focused areas. They aren't necessarily in the big data realm. They aren't in the most cutting edge computational area. It's always assumed that women and people of color are going to be in sort of the softer side of GIS.
I guess I'm next. How did you get into GIST? Like what specific, what sort of motivated your interest in the field?
That's a really good question. So I started out as a human geographer at University of Arizona, and I was very much during my master's, my first year of my master's, I was a human geographer, but I really struggled with the social theory. And I started out by TAing. I was a teaching assistant for the big Intro to GIS class, and I actually loved it. I actually really, really liked TAing. I was TAing for Gary Christopherson, and I really enjoyed it. And then I kind of realized, well, I could do little bits of this for my research. And so I started taking more and more GIS classes, and finally taking all of the GIS classes that Arizona had to offer at the time. And they were all in natural resources, and they were all crossed with environmental stuff. And I was like, I'm talking about human mating patterns. And everyone else was talking about, like, riparian vegetation. And I was like, where is the best place to find a date? And based on these like economic factors. And so I continued to kind of try to bridge in these ways of looking at humans and ways of looking at the things that people do and that are secretive, these sort of layers of society that we interact with, but maybe aren't well drawn out on the map. And I got really excited by this. And I kept trying to do it both ways, of bringing the GIS into human geography and bringing the human geography into GIS. But it was really a challenge because there weren't very many people who were doing this at the time. And this was like 2007, 2008, around that time period. I ended up writing my master's thesis on an econometric model of Craigslist and looking at like the casual encounters section of Craigslist at the time and modeling out how that worked across space. I ended up continuing to do this, and eventually I got really excited about a lot of the research that was sort of just starting to emerge in the field at the time. Matt Zook and Mark Graham were working on a lot of things looking at mapping out internet practices. And so then I went and was a visiting scholar at the University of Kentucky for the last 18 months of my PhD. And that was enormous. It made a huge difference in, I started making maps and vlogging, and it was a really great way to start to create and play with these ideas and start putting them out there, as far as saying like, hey, look, we can actually map out a lot of these things that we just kind of assume are happening. And in human geography, we're kind of making assumptions, bridging together practice and saying, well, this is an interesting thing. But now we suddenly had these new tools, suddenly social media was possible to archive and to map, and there weren't quite the same protections on it that there are now. It was very easy to do. And so we started doing that. And it was a phenomenal experience to suddenly have actual results of like, what does the geography of a practice look like?
And I should have mentioned earlier to anyone watching this, Monica is actually an alum of our department, as you could probably tell while you were talking about it. But that leads to, what you just mentioned leads to my next question. And you briefly mentioned a couple researchers, and I'm curious whether it's in the past or kind of your journey to where you are now, but who's inspired your research and work on that journey?
Sure. I mean, I was broadly inspired by sort of the big theoretical ideas in this field, like Manuel Castells and people like that. But I was also really inspired by sort of the work that was happening at the time, that was really at the groundbreaking in like 2008, 2010. And this would be like the work that at the time Mike Goodchild was doing around the idea of volunteer geographic information. Andrew Turner was doing around the idea of neogeography. Mark Graham was doing around neogeography as well. Matt Zook and Mark Graham were doing around DigiPlace and those sort of ideas. But more recently, I've been more inspired by the theories that are trying to enhance diversity within the field, like Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology, looking at the ways that algorithms worsen social inequalities or social biases, looking at Catherine D'Ignazio's work, enhancing intersectionality within data science. Those sort of ideas are, I really am excited about the idea of bridging that with geography, and particularly GIS, I guess.
Monica, what would you say is the biggest factor that's helped you succeed in your career to this point?
That is a really good question. I think that the ability to do research, the ability to bring together both the technology and the social theory, that I was really lucky to have a background in social theory from Arizona. And I was also really lucky that at the time that I was at Arizona, we had to take history of geographic thought, and we had to actually think about like, what are the historical precedences of what is the lineage of your knowledge of where do you think about this from? And that isn't common in GIS education in the US now, unfortunately, that a lot of GIS scientists don't think about like, what is the history of this thought that you have, or the ideas that you're coming up with. And I think I really benefited from having that, and from being able to contextualize that and bring that forward, and to give sort of my brand of GIS a very critical lens.
So I would say you're alluding to this already, but we were curious if there were specific, because you're kind of talking about this right now, theories, or, I mean, you've already talked about topics, and maybe this is in the past or currently that you continually pull from or use in your research. And maybe it would be helpful for people watching who aren't familiar with your research to explain maybe one of your recent research projects and how you approach that.
Well, so I have a book coming out this year on misinformation in the digital age, which is really looking at this American infodemic problem of where does information come from, but also who has the right to speak for a community, and who has the right to peddle falsities within a community, and how we consume within a community this assumption of local information versus kind of non-local information, and the sort of parallel to local foods movement in that. And that's my book, but I mean, more right now, I'm actually going back to sort of thinking again about like maps and power in a different way, of going back to thinking about Google Maps and Apple Maps and OpenStreetMap, and the ways that they reproduce inequalities on the map. So as far as broad theories go, J.B. Harley's Deconstructing the Map comes up and comes back in every single thing I write. Every single thing I do always comes back to thinking again about who has the power to speak within this map, whose voice is represented and whose voice is not represented, and who is left unsaid or unrepresented, and maybe whose power and interest that falls within.
So following up on that, Monica, in the current socio-political environment, what strategies do you pursue to do you implement to pursue racial and social justice in your current research, as well as your teaching in the courses?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try to be as inclusive as possible. And this means bringing in collaborators and bringing in students into my work who are more able to speak for different communities, and listening to how they speak to different communities and how they represent different communities and different bases of knowledge. And those communities might not be quite as defined as just racial difference or gender difference. They are often defined in these microcosms of like working class upper Midwesterners versus British immigrants from Greece or whatnot. There's a huge diversity of it, and thinking about like, okay, how does it represent them, or how does it represent this otherness within that? I try as best as I can, but I also acknowledge that I can't speak for everybody at all. I could really only speak for myself within this realm of work.
I'm curious if, you talked a lot about the power of the map and those kind of aspects, and it started to make me think about the digital divide and the idea, right, that we have a large population of people who have access to digital, what would we say, media products, whatever, computers, internet access, and we have a large population that doesn't. And I'm curious if any of your research tries to go into those local communities and empower those people who actually don't have access. And I think that part of that traditionally came out of the maybe volunteer GIS area or participatory GIS, if you do any of that type of research.
Yeah, I mean, as much as those digital divides are very relevant and very prominent, and I do a lot of pulling data from social media to represent a whole variety of phenomena. I'm also very concerned about the digital divides that exist within particular households. So the ways that men and women may be using social media differently or consuming different information in different ways. And the different ways that this projects power within a family. And this can be as powerful as decisions around vaccinations and decisions around believing in the health and the efficacy of vaccines for COVID, and how decisions are made based on information consumed online that may be local, it may not be local, it may be racially based, as far as decisions to vaccinate children for COVID or to take particular safety precautions. It can worsen a lot of different community dynamics based on the digital divides, the multiple digital divides that exist within households.
Our final question, how does your work support a more inclusive and engaged community? What type of relationships do you have with communities when you pursue digital mapping in terms of your work?
I am not sure that I do, to be honest. Like I'm not totally sure that I am actually enhancing diversity through this. I am one of the few mothers within this field that I know. There's only like a handful of us who are doing this type of research and who also have care responsibilities. And I am serving as a role model in that capacity and as a mentor within that capacity as well. I have three female PhD students with varying family life goals. I do that part, but I don't do very much of going out into the community and participating with communities of color in a city that has an extreme divide. I live in a city with an extreme divide, but I don't do much to lessen that divide, unfortunately.
Well, and I would say the starting point of doing the research and looking at some of these areas is certainly an important first step.
Yeah, and I speak to that to that step of like who is missing and whose voice is absent and missing. And perhaps there are others who have just said, well, this is what the data shows. And I think that all of those claims are much more nuanced, that the data isn't ever showing the broad arena without a whole bunch of asterisks telling us these various nuances of who was and wasn't included in any particular results. And I speak to that in teaching and in research as well, as far as broadening whose voice is considered within any dominant record.
And one last point that you made me think of, I often struggle with thinking about, my research project may be done, I may present at conferences, but I don't want the results to die in academia, and thinking about how we as researchers can then engage the community or how we get our work out there so that it makes a difference. And I think that that's something that all researchers hopefully think about, and how we move it beyond academia so that it's not just a publication for someone to read later on, that it actually. But.
Yeah, and one thing that I was really benefited during my PhD in doing is blogging about these micro results that you have, blogging about the asterisks that come with any claim and what the claim is as well. And so putting the research out in a way that was accessible for a very broad audience. We did this through the Floating Sheep blog, which you can still read the archives of today, even though it's been inactive for maybe 5 years now. You can still read about this, the ways that we used, Morin's eye to communicate something very broadly to a community about clusters of beer versus clusters of church, and where people are tweeting about these different claims. And so the ways that we sort of translated very traditional spatial statistics to be accessible to a broad audience. And that was picked up a lot by a lot of media. A lot of these claims of that there's something going on in the upper Midwest relating that is some sort of racist claims are coming out of Wisconsin and upper Michigan. And there's something going on, figuring that out before the 2016 election, that there was something wrong with Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, but we didn't know what, just that we can show that there's something happening. And these are the claims that are really hard to publish academically, but we were able to do it in a way that it could enter into popular press and it could reach a much broader audience than just academic dissemination alone.
So as a follow-up question, that Monica, I mean, I've marveled at, your ability not only just really conduct some cutting-edge scholarly research, which is what Jenny was alluding to, but also the work that you've done on the ground in terms of for popular consumption, and how you've been able to really make your mark also, like with the Floating Sheep blog. Can you, that for many academics, that's not necessarily intuitive. And so I'm wondering if there was a particular person who influenced you in sort of, wanting to pursue a more popular avenue for your research, or was there a class you took or some sort of training? I know you had said you started this when you were at the end of your PhD in Kentucky, but did that just happen organically, or can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I joined up with Matt Zook, who was at University of Kentucky at the time, and he definitely inspired me in this way because he was already trying to do it, and they didn't really have much for GIS. They had ways of kind of collecting internet data, but their mapping techniques were very, very rough when I joined. And so I sort of added much more GIS, and then it became even more GIS-y after that. But the goal was, again, there's a lot of results that you often have of things that you think are interesting or ideas that you're working on that aren't publishable yet. They're sort of like, this avenue was really interesting. This was a result that I had, but the result didn't really show anything. You can kind of make that fun and have fun with that result. Or sometimes it was much more fun to work on the blog than to actually publish something. Like, there's a lot of pressure when you're publishing, and it's much easier when you've already explored and experimented with an idea, and even experimented publicly and gotten feedback on an idea. I think that, again, we were doing this at the very beginning of Twitter. Twitter was only about 3 or 4 years old as a technology. It's 2008, 2009, 10, 11, that time period. It was just sort of emerging on the scene. And here we were already taking it and mapping it, and other people weren't doing that. And these are very simple maps. They weren't groundbreaking. We weren't inventing a new statistical measure. We weren't inventing a new cartographic technique. We were applying things that already existed, but applying it in a way that made it accessible to a new source. Or here's what we think is interesting about this. Yes, it is just, a Moran's eye. There's nothing new or innovative about that. I am just applying it to terms that have already been established, but and finding results that are already established within documented literature, but I can describe it in a way that is interesting, that says what I think is going on as the underlying philosophy, underlying foundation within society. And I can use this to tell me something about the world. And I think that's where it became more relevant to the press, was that often it was like, here's something that's happening within a community. It also, at the same time, we were creating the maps that are still used in a lot of other methods in GIS classes, that I'll get random texts from people being like, my methods class is showing your maps. I'm like, yay, great, I'm glad you are. But we were creating graphics that we thought were funny and fun. And again, this was having a beer and making maps, which isn't necessarily what you do as part of your published academic record. This is more just like having fun with the technology, which is what I'd always wanted to do. And so it gave me that avenue to do that. And now I encourage my grad students to start blogging pretty early in your graduate career as a way to explore the ideas that you're doing, put it out there, and sort of build a name for yourself around your own research. Get what you're doing out there, because this doesn't exist. There isn't necessarily already an avenue of experts that are going to critique you necessarily. Instead, if you do get that critique, think about how you've engaged somebody else in the world around your work. It's really hard to do early in your graduate career.
I'm curious, and you may not know the answer to this, but as I was hearing you talk about Twitter, in the time frame, I remember thinking when it became very popular, I'm just a little bit too old for this. And a lot of my friends didn't use Twitter either. And maybe that was just my own small social circle, but I did see over time A lot of academics start to adopt it and use it as a way to communicate information. It was sort of a professional platform versus maybe a more individual platform. I'm just curious if you noticed changes in whose voices were represented as you looked at Twitter data or where it was coming from, and perhaps that was impossible on such a large scale when we're talking about big data like that. But if you've seen demographics change over time as you've done research on social media and these different platforms, or kind of who is represented.
Sure. Well, so even though Facebook started first before Twitter, Twitter was early on adopted in poorer communities. It was earlier adopted in Brazil. It was earlier adopted in larger parts of Africa. It was earlier adopted by African American communities within the US. And this was largely because even when digital divides existed, you could SMS into Twitter early on. And now, most people use their smartphone or use their computer to tweet or whatever tablets or technologies you had. But this wasn't possible with other social media. So early on, Twitter was more the choice of diversity. Now, what you see is when you look at like age structures that, Facebook is rapidly emerging among grandmothers, that you do see a lot more growth within Facebook of that. But there's also another problem that Twitter is largely open, like it's very easy to use their API and to access large amounts of data. And Facebook is really closed in that effect. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal made Facebook even more closed to outside investigation, which means that the ways that rumor and gossip spread and the ways that misinformation is adopted and repurposed and the way more nefarious actions happen, that's more likely to happen behind closed doors and behind external observation on Facebook and to happen among the communities that Facebook is more accessible to. So that is sort of a change that has happened, and that's happened more where Twitter has the openness. So it is very possible to see as these things evolve and emerge on Twitter, and it's very difficult to see it in other social media forms. And now we have these other ones that have popped up, Parler more recently, Gab was before that. We have Clubhouse, Discord, these various ones that are popping up with absolutely minimal regulation as far as stopping and preventing disinformation and the sort of harms to democracy that come from unmonitored, trusted misinformation.
Well, I just want to wrap up and say thank you for taking the time out of your day to chat with us. It was exciting to hear about all of the research that you're doing in a really important field. And we're excited to have heard from you and about what you're working on.
Absolutely. And I hope that this works. And I hope that you guys are able to get more people excited about GIST. I really believe in what you're doing. And I think Arizona's doing a great job in this avenue. And I hope to get to meet you all in person sometime soon.
Thanks, Monica.
Thank you.